a little bit of a concern for us when we think about the cost of CNG right now versus diesel versus what will be replaced with either hydrogen or electric. The electric piece, which I think we talked a little bit about in the meeting, is not a one-for-one. So if we replace a diesel bus with an electric bus, we really need about 1.5 electric buses to equal the range of a diesel bus. And so now we have a need for more infrastructure to house buses. Now we may be drawing down potential more electricity off the grid, which may or may not be there during the summer periods, right? Like so, hydrogen, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, is sort of the one that sticks out more than the others. I think there's a hope that, and right now, I think the hydrogen being trucked in is somewhere between LA and Coachella Valley. And really north of there, I think there's only one other station potentially in Sacramento, which actually feeds Oregon and Washington. So I think when we thought we were getting into 2024, 2025, we would be a lot further along with these hydrogen farm stations that would exist within the region. There just aren't, which is why you're seeing the liquefied form being trucked in. It's a lot more cost effective. But I think if we could get more infrastructure in the county, we'll definitely turn that price down. But unfortunately, as a function of federal grants and state mandates, we're pretty much either tied to electric or hydrogen. We don't have much of a choice unless we want to purchase diesel or CNG vehicles on our own and use no federal or state money to use them, which won't work for us in California because the mandate anyway, we have to get rid of it.
I was under the idea that CNG was zero emissions. That's why I kept asking. And then I went home and looked into it and I was like, oh man, we have no choice.
Yeah, so it's near zero, but it's not fully zero. But so much cleaner than diesel fuel. And really it's the same equipment. It's just a transition on the engine side where you have to tune it up because they run a little hotter. So, it's the same, pretty much the same commons network between the engine and the cradle. It's just a tuning of utilizing the compressed natural gas versus diesel and the compression part of the engine. So, it's interesting that CNG got sort of knocked off the list because I think a lot of agencies, especially in California, there's a ton of agencies that are invested in CNG. And to really sort of walk off of that into a hydrogen scenario is a pretty significant investment. And I think the piece which we talked a little bit about at the board meeting is, I remember 2 years ago, we went and talked to the Appropriations Committee, both on the House and the Senate side in DC, and they asked straight up, because I was involved in the program at the time, that did we make the right decision? And I said, look, I don't think that's how you have to look at it. It was individuals with limited information making what they thought was the best decision at the time. And the best decision was we want to push forward with how to protect the environment and how to do these things in real time. The drawback to that is it's not as simple as transitioning over to just a bus. There's just giant infrastructure that has to exist in the background to make that work. And the FTA, the federal government, and the Department of Energy at the time were sort of unwilling to find additional money to help shore those problems up. So I would say, in addition to the equipment issues we have, one of the bigger issues is a lot of agencies, and I think we've been fortunate, but a lot of agencies can't afford the infrastructure to get to that point. And so that's kind of where they're getting hit. And it's the old don't believe the hype. Like when electric first came out, they talked about how much more cost effective it was than the diesel bus. Well, the reality is the most cost effective bus that any transit agency has is a 2000 diesel only, has the lowest cost per mile of any bus that's out in the world right now because there's no electric components on it, there's no hybrid components, there's no hydrogen. And we accept those as we go forward, but we just have to sort of understand how that impacts the organization and potentially what impact that has on service, right? So if we see this giant cost in fuel, what service does that disrupt, right? And maybe not this year, but 4 or 5 years down the road, how does that disrupt service by adding 25% cost to our fuel budget? And like what gets cut? And I think that's the piece that probably concerns us a little bit.
Yeah, and also to add to that, ACT is already very green because 100% of the gas that our fleet uses is renewable. It's come from the renewable sources. So we're already green with our CNG, RNG. So we call renewable natural gas. So yeah,
And not that.
Oh, I'm
yeah,
sorry, I
go
was
ahead.
just gonna ask you, would you want us to ask our questions during the presentation or after? Because I know previously we've done after, so just procedurally, I just want to check in with you. Would you prefer during, or would you, what's your preference?
I have no preference, it's
Okay.
whatever works best for the
Okay.
group.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's-
that's
it's-
what
it's-
I
it's-
thought.
it's-
Yeah,
it's-
yeah.
No,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
fine, that's
Yeah.
fine. I just want to make sure that we are timely and at the same time we get through what we need to, but we can totally ask during. I just didn't want to, I wanted to make sure we get through what we need to today,
whatever works
so,
for you.
yeah, totally, totally.
So I have a follow-up question on that because I was thinking further of our budget and where we're kind of heading. And a lot of where we're heading is because of this situation. So those that may have the infinite wisdom to make these decisions, do they have any wisdom as to possibly providing some funding to help us with some of this infrastructure? And just to say also, I was just talking to a business person last night that runs a very large company, and he was talking about this exact thing, and what this is going to do to their business is astronomical.
Yeah, I think from what I've seen, at least on the West Coast, is the answer to that question is carbon credits. And I'm not totally sure that that is the best utilization of businesses that have been in it within the place for 30, 40 years, longer, 100 years, and they're just not in a space where they can wholesale out their production line or the things that they use to manage their business into a no or low emission. And there's a challenge also there. On the public transit side, we've recently had a lot more conversations with the DoD and with the Department of Energy about grants that would have existed through their programs. Like electric's the best example of that. Like talking to DoD about how a complete changeover or a large changeover to an electric vehicle fleet for public transportation has an impact on the national security of the electric grid. Right, like we'll be drawing down infinite amounts of power. Like I know we did here, but at the last place I was at, we put our first 10 buses we put in required us to put in a 25K transformer on a block that had 70-year-old electric lines. Right, so we had to change the entire block essentially by 10 electric buses. And I think in theory, you want to make that change, right? Like how can we have an impact on the environment? How can we have an impact on these things? But without that infrastructure money, it's nothing. And I think the state struggles with it a little bit. I think they've always wanted to try to help out, but then we run into a situation like SB 125 where they close the money. And so, is the state really a reliable source to be able to find infrastructure money? Probably not. Are the feds a reliable source to find infrastructure money? It is if you're lucky enough to get an earmark or a project that fits into the scope of the Department of Energy, or you have a shovel-ready project that's ready to go. So the answer is yes and no. Unfortunately, in some areas it is, and in a lot of areas it's probably there's a lot of talk about it, but we're not seeing that investment on the bottom line to be able to disseminate to. And it's not just public transit agency, right? It's local cities, it's local jurisdictions, it's counties, it's like all the groups that are impacted by that, right? Like fire departments and school districts and police departments, and all of that, right? Like anybody that would have a vehicle transition plan. Notoriously, schools had carved out for a while, and now they're in the mix. And I don't know how a school district is going to be able to afford that sort of fleet transition.
A couple of operational notes, just so this group's aware of sort of our implementation and how we're managing this. So what we've done is, we've taken delivery of both fuel cell electric and battery electric vehicles. Those have not been put into operation. The hydrogen electric vehicles, because of what Sean noted earlier and the high mobile fueling costs, we're actually delaying the implementation of those because to put those into full service operation when we're taking the really high costs, $60, $80 fuel is too much. So we're part of our budget exercise in FY25 was to very much limit the pre-work on those vehicles. And so once the station comes online in October, that's when we'll put those into service. So just so the board's aware of that. And then we get, that'll be the first 12, and then the second tranche would be towards the end of the year. So towards into next year, this time next year, the full 35 of the hydrogens and the 6 EVs will be put into service. So you'll see that come online over starting June and then over the preceding months after that. But we've scaled it both for some operational and safety reasons, but also because of the high cost of fueling that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I think it's probably important to talk about that number a little bit. So we had the 12, and I think that the number that we had estimated just until the fueling station was online to do the mobile fueling was 2 million. A little less than that.
The cost of the hydrogen, it was initially 2 million, but then we scaled that down to almost half.
Yeah, we cut it. It was 2 million just to get us from
Just to get us
June to
the
October.
station.
So we scaled that, yeah. So you may get questions of why we haven't put those hydrogens into service, and that's why we're managing the cost of the fuel.
I was just gonna say, for those that can't see, that's Chris Orlando.
Sorry,
speaking.
that's just the voice from
Because
beyond.
yeah, the voice from behind the camera. Perfect. I was going to say, just in the interest of time, if you can mark down what your slide number and your question is, because I've been doing that for ours, that would be awesome. I think that way we can get through the presentation, ask our questions, and have a more robust discussion. And I know we also have to ask for public comment. So let's go ahead and maybe get through the presentation, and then we'll ask our questions once public comment is done. Thank you.
Also within the outlook is liability insurance. Again, something that's really not in NCD's control. There is a cap that is adjusted every 5 years by the Secretary of Transportation. The railroad liability cap currently for NCD is $323 million. So it has been challenging to secure coverage to domestic insurers. And we typically, or what we have been doing is recurring to the foreign markets to be able to meet those insurance limits. And those foreign insurers are constantly reevaluating their position in the US market based on all claims of all sectors. So that's how they spread the risk. And the liability premiums for those premiums have far exceeded CPI. You will see in the budget, we are actually increasing our budget for liability insurance by 15% compared to FY24. And then talking a little bit more also about the mandate on zero emission. First started with us, now there's a mandate for rail. So the likely the Sprinter will have to transition to zero emission by 2035. The estimated cost just for the equipment is between 120 and $229 million. And then obviously there's more costs associated to infrastructure and potential modification to station platforms. Neither the platforms or stations or facilities nor the equipment has any funding source at this time. So I'm going to give a brief summary of what are NCD's major funding sources. From the federal side, we receive what's called formula funds. These are under 5307, 5337, 5339. 5307 is driven primarily by population. And 5337, it is a combination of some population, but there's also service metrics incorporating the calculation. Those are apportioned to the San Diego region, but as you can see, there's 2 transit operators within the region, and the distribution between NCTD MTAs is very closely matched to the population of a service area. So NCTD gets allocated 30% of that. And for FY 2025, approximately $49.2 million are going to come from the FTA from those 3 formula funds. We also have some state funding. Major sources of state funding is the state transit assistance, state of good repair. The revenue from those sources come primarily from the statewide sales tax on gasoline and diesel. There are 2 components in that calculation. One of them is based on population, and the other one is based on the revenues. So for this coming fiscal year, NCTD would be allocated $14.2 million for STA and $2 million for SGR. And then SC 125, that's something new. Sean briefly mentioned that is a one-time funding source. It was on April 30 of 2024, the state froze those funding. It was supposed to be received over the course of 2 years. For the first year, it was 48.2 for TRCP on the first year, and ZTC funds, which is Zero Emission Transition Capital Program. Those were $15.5 million over the course of 4 years. $5 million was supposed to be received in FY 25, The majority of the funding from those two programs was going to be for capital projects, NCTD, though if the funding is frozen, the capital projects are going to be impacted are going to be the San Diego double track phase 1, San Diego double track phase 2, and then Class 5. So it's a 60-day freeze, so we don't know yet where we are at that. Other revenue sources still are the Transportation Development Act. It's called TDA. This is revenue that's derived from sales tax. Those are also split between NCTD and MTS based on population, approximately 29% for the 30% for FTA is very close to population that is fixed every year. It doesn't change. The TDA is revised every year based on population estimates. We have been at 29% for a long, long time. So for FY25, we will be allocated $55.7 million. The 100% of this funding within our budget is going to be used to support operations. And we also receive Transnet, which is a sales tax for San Diego County. And for FY, we received two major sources from Transnet. One of them is what called transit support, which is shared between NCTD and MTS. Same formula, 29% NCTD, 70% MTS. And we also receive what's called Transnet 8.1%. This was a carve out from Transnet that was to subsidize increased services after the Transnet ordinance was passed. And the only service that we currently have that's eligible for this funded is the Transnet Coastal Expansion Service. As everyone knows, we increased our coastal frequencies in October 2021, and those incremental trips are being funded by Transnet 8.1. So for FY25, that's $8.1 million. So outside of funding from the state, federal, and local, we have internally generated revenues. These are other revenues, fare revenues. Those are the fares that we collect from passengers that ride in our system. We estimate our fare revenues based on our service level projections. And also for FY25, we have the Youth Opportunity Pass, which is funded through standard, and it allows youth ages 18 and younger to ride free in the system. And then other revenues that we have are, operations, use maintenance, and dispatching fees that we collect from BNSF, Amtrak, and Metrolink based on shared use agreements for the use of our right-of-way on the San Diego subdivision and on a limited basis on the SMU subdivision for BNSF. We also get some credits for our use of our renewable natural gas. As I mentioned earlier, 100% of the gas that's used by Breeze fleet is renewable. So we get some credits to a state program and a federal program. And investment income, obviously, those are the monies that the interest that we gain on our investment from the excess cash that we have. And we also have some minor other revenues associated with leases and permits. So moving a little bit on the major assumptions for operating expenses. We are increasing our salaries, personnel costs. We are bringing in 21 facility custodians. This is just a change in business model. NCP used to contract out the facility custodian, which is an janitorial services. We are now those in-house. We did make a cost analysis. It is cost neutral. We're bringing that in-house. We're also adding additional personnel for rail maintenance and operations, transportation, and asset management. Also within our operating budget, we are increasing our health contribution for our employees. Last time NCPD increase of health contribution was in 2013. That was over 10 years ago. So we have included a 20% increase in our contribution that quite frankly doesn't make it up with the increasing health costs, but that's incorporated in our budget. Another large item within our budget is the agreement with MV Transportation. Under agreement 17033, we contract bus operations and maintenance with MV Transit. That contract is valued at $50.9 million for this coming fiscal year. Also within this line item, we are increasing costs associated with the Sorrento Valley Coastal Connection, as well as NCT Plus, which is our macro transit service. Within the contract for MV, we are required to increase by either the lower of 3% of CPI or CPI. So CPI was more than 3%, but based on contract terms, we still have to adjust by 3%. So you're gonna see an increase on that cost line item. And for our fuel budget consumption, we assume the Brent crude oil price for diesel, which feeds our Coaster Sprinter fleet. We assume $100 per barrel. And we shared earlier how we came out with a cost for our hydrogen fleet as well. And the CNG cost is based on the trends of CNG pricing in the last few months. Property and liability insurance is expected or is budgeted at 15% higher than we were in FY24. We also have one-time expenses of $6.1 million for various consulting services, contingency of $500,000. The pension liability, the pension payment for an unfunded accrued liability, and the payment for our debt, the principal payments, those are not part of the operating budget. Those are paid from net assets. Reason why is that those are already existing liabilities in the books, so those are not really operating costs. Those are, our obligations, and we are mandated to make those payments. So those are going to be paid out of net assets and not from the operating budget. This is a quick recap of the FTEs for CP of the district. As I mentioned earlier, the higher increase is going to be mostly under development services, which includes the headcount for the custodian, facilities custodians. This table summarizes our operating budget for the next coming fiscal year. It's the same summary that we presented to our board last week. We are projecting an increase of our expenses of 1.4% compared to the budget that we proposed in FY24. This is a 5-year plan. This is a forecast or projection of our next 5 years. Some things to note is that the board has a goal of investing at least $50 million a year in capital investment. That's 1.5. $50 million is a minimum goal, but $50 million does not get you a lot today. I don't think it gets you even 10 hydrogen buses, to be honest. And we have a lot of facilities, stations, coaster overhauls, sprinter overhauls that are part of our capital program. So as I mentioned earlier on the slide is that we will be relying much more on discretionary funding to be able to meet our state of good repair capital needs. But just as a $50 million as a baseline, we will see a deficit in FY29 because we will not have enough funding from our formula funds to cover those minimum capital needs. So as part of this presentation, I will be also, I included some slides related to our cost recovery fee. This is a document that is part of our operating budget every year. Cost recovery fees are fees that we charge to third parties for various type of services. Those include permits, incidental uses, and right-of-way support services. Those are presented for the board approval because those are charges that we have to make for third parties that request these services from NCTD. The permits are charged based on actual cost. That means that staff time that is used to process those permits, including fully burdened costs, is what is charged for permits. Incidental uses, the cost for leases, those were revised in 2023 based on a study that was done by CBRE, and they reflect fair market value. This table summarizes the permits and right-of-way costs for flagging that we will be charging for the next upcoming fiscal year. As you can see, a permit cost recovery is based on actual cost. The cost for roadway worker protection and for flagging, those are contracted to Jacobs. So the cost that we charge to third parties is a pass-through of under the Jacobs contract. For the incidental use fees, there are no changes for FY 24, so we'll be charging the same cost, that we had, last year. Same thing here, there is no changes from, fiscal 24 and any of the charges. So next steps, on June 4, we will be releasing, documents for public review and comment. The documents that we will be releasing include the full budget document as well as the cost recovery schedule, the service implementation plan, and the classification and compensation schedule. And in June 2024, we'll be back at the board to set the public hearing as well as request approval for of the adoption of the FY 25 budget. So now I think we have plenty of time, so we can answer any questions.
Perfect, thank you. Before we do that, can I check in to see if we have any public comments for the item?
We do not.
Okay, great. So at this time, public registration to comment on this item has closed, so we'll go ahead and get started with questions. I know I have quite a few, but I'll defer to you all first. So does anyone want to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, all right.
I need my page numbers, but let me go back.
They're a bit different than those ones, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
I noticed
like that.
these.
Yeah, I
Okay.
am too.
So I think my question here was covered. On my page 4, I think it was.
Page 9. Okay.
Okay.
Plus 5 or something, yeah.
Okay. We talked about the discretionary grants. And so I think you already covered this because it came up. I think I wrote my question before you started talking. Basically, we're going to be relying heavily on discretionary grants.
From a capital perspective, I believe so, both at the discretion at the federal level and then non-operating grant money at the state.
Okay.
A lot of, I think you touched on it, we've had to transition a fair amount of what we may have used for capital into operating to make sure that the service is protected at least for the next 3 to 4 years. And that includes no service increases, which is also of concern for us. We have some plans we'd like to increase service a little bit. So
Right, we've been talking about that for quite a while. So if the money doesn't come in, then not only will the projected service increases maybe not happen, but it could affect our current level.
it could, I think, really it's on 2 levels. There's a potential opportunity for us to have a service problem in addition to the capital problem that we already see on the back 2 years of the 5. And so I think aggressively, we need to sort of rethink our strategy on how we interact with Sandag, where some of these funding sources come from. Is population-based the best way to do it? There's a couple different ways you can cut out formula funding. Should Sandag be the one collecting the formula funds and disseminating it to NCT and MTS, right? There's just a lot of things that go in. I think, those aren't the only things. We have to look at every piece of the funding picture to decide whether or not, because of either the growth happening in East and North County or just the general lack of sales tax increase we're seeing from a percentage standpoint, are we collecting from the right revenue source?
Right.
Especially on the operating piece.
Right. Because one of the things we've talked about is in order to get more ridership, we need to have more service at the right times available to people. So if we start cutting it back, then we're going to be having our ridership go in a different direction.
Yeah, and it's an interesting piece too. We've been having a lot of conversation about like that range. When you look at the slide that shows the range of the Sprinter transition in 2035, right? Could be anywhere from 120 to 200X. I think you're seeing that on some of our projects now where we had a plan, we set a date, for whatever reason, our work with our partners pushed that date out and we added 10 million here, 20 million here, and that's a problem. So on the Sprinter piece specifically, we've had conversations about trying to aggressively find money to switch out the fleet because the Sprinter vehicles will not make it to 2035. I'm not even sure they can make it to 2027. I mean, so these are the things in reality that we're trying to have conversations about how much additional money will it cost us every year we wait to transition a fleet. How much will the capital cost to us to have to redo the stations in 2035 instead of 2027, right? So there's a lot of pieces that I think kind of go into that, that from an agency perspective, not only do we need to aggressively find the money, we probably need to push the gas pedal down on moving them a little quicker if and when we can to try to save future costs to the agency that will just be rolled into the capital price. You know, where that money comes from, I think is a chief concern, especially on the operating piece.
Yeah, and that brings me to page 7, where you talked about my page 7 in the presentation, where you talked about the Sprinter replacement by 2035, yet the other replacements are not until 2040. So we almost have to get the Sprinter replacement lined up before the other. And so the question is the equipment out there?
So there's equipment available out there. Interestingly enough, in the rail market right now, there's some hydrogen vehicles being tested. There are electric vehicles out there. There's a pretty significant cost on the capital side for us to put a catenary along the line. And the reality is it doesn't always go over super great with communities because it can be a little bit of an eyesore, especially if it's moving through town and not necessarily adjacent to a freeway or something like that. And I think you see that
You're
with,
talking about the overhead.
yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, the overhead catenary for the electric. There's sort of we've been having conversations with our rail team about a fix in the meantime, which is sort of a dual, a 4-engine setup where 2 are diesel and 2 are battery. And then as we get closer to 2035, we can transition the diesel engines over to a battery storage situation when that technology sort of improves. And so there's just a lot of stuff out there right now. Hydrogen is in test phase. There's one north in the San Jose area that they're working on right now that I think we're curious to see what comes out of that. But much like buses, the hydrogen piece is super complicated on rail, especially when you're talking about either a vehicle or an engine itself. But the sooner we can move on this, because realistically, I mean, we have to own it. We have some service issues on the Sprinter because we have a one-off, but one of ever of its kind vehicle. And so out of the 12 vehicles we have at any given time, we have usually 4 or 5 single units that are running and either one or no spares. And that's a problem. You know, we have too many intermittent mechanical issues that are probably prohibiting us from gaining ridership because we're not able to be reliable and we're not able to move that frequency up until we address that. So.
Okay, and then on page 9, you talked about the spending freeze, 60-day spending freeze, while we wait and find out if the freeze goes beyond that or the funds are reallocated or diminished in some way. Do we go back and reevaluate the capital projects to see, you know, maybe the one at the top isn't the one that should be at the top, or what do we do when that money might not come in? What do we do?
Yeah, I think our approach has been kind of all of those things. I think when we sit in a room, we talk about all of the projects we've got on the list and which ones we might be able to accomplish with the capital budget we have, which ones probably are in need of some significant priority. You know, that's not the only place we're necessarily losing funding. We were just notified the other day that about $340 million that was tied to Del Mar for movement of the rail. One point in time, the board, I believe, and the agency had asked that money be reallocated to other NCTD transit projects, and they didn't do that. So now the money's being pulled back by the state. So we essentially lost $340 million that could have been used for some of these other capital projects, and that's a giant red flag for us. You know, then it goes back to kind of the conversation we're having about what are our partners doing. So when we talk about, I think what's probably a little different here than some other places is our ability to directly manage capital projects is tied to SANDAG pretty closely. And so on some of the bigger ones, it's not super easy for us to be able to just reallocate funding to something else. We have to get sort of the partners together to discuss what that means. And it usually doesn't happen overnight, and I think that's another piece we need to look into as well. But when we have things locally that are low hanging fruit and we see some of this, we think that money's going to be there. It's just going to be pushed off. What is it that we had on the slate this year to do with that money that either we can find local money to do because we need to get it done, or we need to push it off into 26, 27?
Okay, and then on page 10, talking about the Transnet 8.1, that, I'm a little confused on that. Is that related to sales tax?
Yes.
So, okay,
It's a carve out from the
It's a-
transit ordinance,
okay,
dedicated for established services.
okay. And so if sales tax is going flat or diminishing in some of our local areas, probably the same thing's gonna happen here. So what happens if this starts being reduced and this is related to expanding coaster service, then we could have an expansion of coaster service. It's all going great, and then we have to pull it back.
So Transit 8.1, when the extension ordinance was passed, it was building reserves, so the money was protected, so they have reserves. So as the services coming in, MTS has 3 or 4 services that are eligible for that. One of them is the Blue Line that just opened the Mid-Coast. So there's some reserve funding. However, we made a presentation a couple years ago that the projections that Sienna did initially on Transit 8.1 were too aggressive. So there will be a deficit in the funding. I think it was in how many years? In 2028, 2029,
That's
right?
Yeah.
The overall, the program will have a deficit. It's not just NCT deficit, it also affects MTS.
Right,
Yeah.
right, okay. So we will have to, we'll have to reduce whatever we started.
Well, or we'll have to shift.
We'll have to shift, yeah. And then,
Can I actually follow up on
Yeah,
that since we're already on transit? This is a sales tax. Is there a sunset on that or is that in perpetuity?
2035, there's a sunset.
Yeah, there is,
Yeah.
it's a sunset.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
that's what I thought. I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure. But it seems like we rely pretty well on that. So as we time goes, we're gonna have to figure out what we're gonna do.
Yeah, well, both agencies, NCT, MTS rely significantly on transit for fund operations.
For us, that's a pretty good chunk of
Yeah.
yeah,
cost of
That's what I
service.
figured. So
Yeah.
So when it sunsets, they'll have to go back to a vote.
Yeah, and there's a citizens initiative that they're working on that
Yeah.
is intended to be that backfill that you're talking about. So that's being worked on, yeah.
this is the Sandag one.
Well, it's not Sandag, it's citizens initiative,
Oh,
but
I'm
yes,
sorry,
that's the one.
Yes, yes, but still related,
Yeah, so that's
So-
intended to backfill Transnet as it sunsets.
right,
Yeah.
right.
What do you mean by backfill?
So to pick up when it sunsets, that's what backfill.
Okay, and then my last question, I think is so, and I think I meant to mention this at the board meeting. We kind of have a cliff coming. And so I think, just when you see it on paper, we need to start acting now in the immediate and not pretend like this cliff isn't here. Because, you know, once you see those brackets on paper, I think that's a huge red flag. So all this stuff that we have to do is great stuff. But if we don't have the money to do it and nobody gives it to us, then trying to increase our ridership and provide better service for people, it's gonna be negatively impacted.
I agree. I think you touched on it earlier. Once you start to pull some frequency back, you never really regain that ridership. I think the frequency is the big piece of it. I will say, in this budget process, and I give a lot of credit to the executive staff, that we had quite a few meetings about managing our FTEs and being very thoughtful about what we're asking for throughout the budget and really scaling back and sort of deciding what we want departments to look like. And we're not done with that, I think, throughout this fiscal year, I think, because we were running up on the deadline for this year's budget. Even when you look at the FTEs page, that's a representation of what, in a perfect world, we would probably need to manage some of the services we brought in-house. there are opportunities for us, I think, every time we look at job openings to be able to either shift personnel internally and move some stuff around. How we're managing our contracts with our partners. In fact, in this budget, it's not specifically stated, but we had a little over $1 million programmed into the original budget for a third party to come in and help us with bus transition. And we actually pulled that out because we feel like we have the capable staff internally to be able to manage that. In fact, the person that wrote the scope, I feel like has a pretty good bead on what we would need to do to transition bus and housing. So I've actually asked that individual, Chris and I had meetings with them to work on the transition. And so it's kind of all these things on the rail side. We pulled back some of the contracts we have on the rail transition. And there's just been, I think, a very concerted effort to make sure that we're reviewing not only the personnel piece, but we really want to get to that number that this is the piece we need every year to keep moving the piece we are responsibly. And then the rest of it is really filtered into how much money do we need for operating, how much money do we need for capital. So that's happening almost weekly at the meetings.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Jill or Joe, do either of you have any questions?
I've been thinking about something that you mentioned about large pot of money that was going to do something in Del Mar that's getting pulled back from the state. What was that?
Yeah, it was for the tunnel. It was essentially
Yeah, so as you recall,
So it's nothing with double tracking. It has to do
it
with,
has to do with, there was an allocation last fiscal year by the state of $300 million to support the realignment of the Little Sand Corridor, the tunnel. Sandak had allocated the first 152 million of that, but they had not set a project plan for the second 148. And as part of the May revise, the governor proposed picking back that 148 that's
because
not
the state
been.
has no money.
Yeah, so that's what Griffin.
Yeah, and I think the struggle with that is the language that could have been used for is fairly broad. And I think the board at one point in time in the agency had asked that that money be reallocated to NCTV, other transit projects that were in the works, and it didn't. So essentially, we're in a space where we lost out on a potential, out of the 300 to 340, we lost $148 million of local revenue that could have been used to do some capital projects. That's right.
And I think part of that, if I remember right, was there were a couple projects that would need to have been done before the main project
In sequence. Yeah.
in sequence. And I think the proposal that was sent was to allow a little bit of, allow the money to be moved or allow for these other projects to happen. So it's too bad
It's
there
a
was
weird
such an
deal,
argument over it.
because one was the bridge, right, Mary?
Yeah, so the board approved a letter to Sandag that stated that the San Diego Phase 2 project and Phase 1 was essentially Phase 1 of the tunnel, that the bridge needed to be completed, raised, or else a tunnel would flood. So part of that proposal was suggesting that this direct appropriation that Chris mentioned could be used for that.
And insult to injury, part of our SB 125 funding that's now frozen is funding that project. It's set aside to fund that project. So the San Diego double track project. So yeah, it's all intertwined.
Any other questions, Jill?
Well, I think maybe the other question is sort of moot since there's no money. And that has to do with the words microtransit were used a couple of times, which is of interest to us in Solana Beach, because yes, we have a train station, but we don't necessarily have a way to get people there. And we've often talked about having some sort of microtransit that would go around, collect people, take them, to where there is transit. So is there any money for that at all, or is it just that we're on our own if we want to come up with a plan?
I appreciate that question. I think the way that I've handled that in the past is it's either or. You could find additional funding for it, or if you find that microtransit in some cases can be slightly more effective than fixed route, then you shift the service that's in the area. Typically, microtransit success has a lot to do with geography and ability for a fixed route bus to get to a certain location, whether it's too many hills or landlocked by an interstate or something like that. So I would say it's a little bit of both. If we wanted to add service on, that money's probably not programmed into the budget. If we see an opportunity to do that by shifting fixed route resources into microtransit, there's always a tool for us to do.
And
So-
Sean, for the public, can you explain what microtransit is just briefly?
Yeah, so microtransit is the NCTD Plus, which will be launching here pretty soon. Did a test run yesterday or a couple days ago for 2 days. It went very well. Is our app-based and phone-based sort of a dial a ride. You call in, you can get a ride from any location within that zone to another location within that zone or to a fixed route transit center. It's pretty common in our industry to sort of, I don't say backfill, but sort of supplement the ability to get people from either landlocked or geographically tied in areas to either the fixed route line or to somewhere within that city. So I think there's a fair amount of opportunity for us in North County to be able to sort of implement that in certain cities and see what that success comes in at. We're excited to be at the farmers market pretty soon to launch that. Sorrento Valley Coaster Connection is sort of a hybrid of that a little bit. It's just a different way of sort of looking at the business versus a traditional fixed route 40-footer. I think both are really necessary to be successful, but it's sort of how you provide that extra step of connection to the bus or to the Sprinter or to the train. So definitely some opportunity there.
Thank you. Arjun, do you have any questions?
Just whenever we do get around to talking about replacement of the Sprinter, I'll be talking about the necessity of restrooms in this, on the Sprinter.
Yeah, so
So we don't have to talk about it now, but I'm just throwing it out there. At some point we will, you know.
I'm not advocating to extend my contract to 2035, but as long as I'm here, I would prefer to see bathrooms on the Sprinter vehicles. I think, when we do improve services along that line, I think we will see a little bit of a speed up, but it's not going to be much, maybe 5-10 minutes at most. We're really talking about a 1 hour trip. What we would like to see, and this is just sort of 50,000 foot right now, is some type of a vehicle along the Sprinter line that we could also interchange on coaster. Maybe not a double decker, just a single deck version of sort of what we have out there now, but it has the same amenities as the coaster in terms of restrooms, even to some extent equipment. That requires a little bit of investment for us to put positive train control along that line and change out some of the issues we have in our signalization out there right now. But I think it's all part of the package that we really want to turn that into a robust line to get out as close as we can to 15, because we see that sort of north-south corridor along 13, sort of the next big rail corridor, especially as they're talking about rail coming out of Coachella Valley into the San Bernardino. So, that north-south connectivity there, I think, is going to be a big piece. The vehicles that we want to use, I think we want to interchange them a little bit with our coaster fleet so that non-peak times of the day, we can run singles along the coast if we need to not necessarily have our big chargers out there. So definitely want restrooms on this, sure.
All right, thank you. That's it.
Okay. I have a few questions as well. So I'm assuming this is slide 10. I'm adding 5 to my slide and we'll see if that's the right one. Okay, yeah, I think it is slide 10. So on here it's slide 5, but I think it's slide 10. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I know we talk about, it says that we're going to obviously have these partnerships, and then we talked about providing subsidies for these services. What are we projecting in terms of costs for that? And if that isn't already something that we've built in, like as a year over year?
For Sorrento Valley or for Elon?
No, I would say, well, I mean, I'm guessing if specifically Sorrento Valley, but then yes, youth opportunity was my second question as well.
Yeah, so that I'm going to answer that 2 ways. And Chris, if you want to jump in here, please do. So the Sorrento Valley Coaster Connection is programmed into the budget currently. Where that funding source comes from is essentially current operating budget. And we are working And Chris has been working pretty hard on trying to secure some contracts with a few of the biotech agencies that are down in that area. Has done a good job. We have at least one in the works and maybe a second one coming up behind it. The piece on the Youth Opportunity Pass, we've had a lot of robust discussion about this internally. Ray, what we really have to weigh with the Youth Opportunity Pass is if Sandag sunsets the program and we don't receive funding for it, I don't necessarily think it's in the best interest of the agency to roll back and start charging youth. There's a lot of reasons I have for that. I've seen a lot of successes with agencies who have focused energy on youth being able to ride. I would say that I'm a big supporter of people who in an adult setting can pay to ride, should pay to ride. I think we have a lot of opportunities to provide people a way to get reduced fares if they need it or something. I think youth is interesting because we don't want public transportation to be a roadblock for the youth. And those are the dynamics of dual income household or dual working household or troubles getting to school, or in some cases, school breakfast or school lunch. So we don't want to be a barrier to that. And so if the service is already there, what is the drawback of us not continuing the Youth Opportunity Pass in the absence of Sandag funding? Or do we just continue the program, right? And I would say I'm an advocate for continuing the program. I think from an agency perspective, we aggressively want to have those conversations with Sandag about we need, not only do we need the funding we get, we need more funding.
Yeah.
And we want to expand the program.
And right now, it's a shared cost, right? I mean, it's not just us subsidizing the program, it's.
No,
them
it's
and us.
through Sandag. So
Okay.
Sandag reimburses us for us and MTS.
Okay. Just, that was what I wanted to clarify.
Now, our agreements are slightly different. So our agreement,
It's a fixed price.
yeah, big credit to the union finance team, is a fixed, where MTS is based on ridership.
Got it. Okay. I guess, should I ask the question? So if they do, whenever that's, I think it's 2026, right? Would be when they plan to, if there's no funding that they've programmed. So let's just say if they don't program it, do we know what we'll have to
Well,
put in for that?
I would think that would be, in addition to a staff recommendation, I think we would want some board concurrence on that. I think
Yeah.
that's important, but my stance on it is that we would want to continue that program and find a way, right? Because it's about service. So
Yeah.
service is already there.
Yeah.
We're not going to pull back service necessarily as a function of the Youth Opportunity Pass going away. Now, is that potential in 28? I don't know. $1.2 million is such a small piece of our budget that I would hate to deny rides to our youth under that guise. But I think that would be something we would want to talk about at a board level, that this program is working. We want to continue that program even in the absence of the funding, and then figure out a way to sort of reapproach that either with school districts or local entities. And figure it out. But our preference would be for Sandag to jump in and keep going.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I'm supportive of it as well. I just wanted to ask because it's coming up. I mean, it's already 2024, so just realizing 2026 is around the corner, and just wanted to confirm that. So then,
Can
Oh,
I
yeah.
ask go ahead, comment or follow up on that? While I think it's a very important program, as is Sorrento Valley, as we get closer to being in a deficit, we're gonna have to figure out, is that prudent to continue that when we know we're gonna be in a deficit? Because what's going to have to be neglected or not done or reduced in order to continue?
Yeah,
So I just think
I
you're
definitely.
gonna have to keep your focus on what's coming.
Yeah, I definitely.
We can't
agree
do
with
everything.
that. Like I think to your point, the Sorrento Valley Coaster addition to the budget was 750,000.
Yeah,
And
that's
so-
about right.
So when we really talk about the money we would get from Sandag for youth opportunity, that 1.2 million is really getting washed throughout the entire system. What we're really talking about, which I think to your point is, how much of that 1.2 million of service would we have to cut back somewhere else completely? And not that we necessarily wouldn't try to protect the youth program, it's just without that money, does that impact Sorrento Valley
Right.
Coast Trans, right? And I think those are the things that, when we talk about the business partnerships with Sorrento Valley, those are things we need to keep an eye on, how we sort of reimagine
Yeah.
what we want to do with Sandag in terms of funding, and maybe even some of our community partners.
I'm assuming we're working with Biocom to like
Yeah.
connect with,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, I was going to say, I mean, I know they were a huge advocate for that, so I would assume they'd try to connect us with the right people.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
they've been super helpful and we're connected, I would say, with the right people on
Okay,
that
great.
front, and they're being supportive and we're making good progress on it. And the other thing to keep in mind on this Sorrento Valley Coaster connection is there's an ancillary impact, right? So about 15% of coaster ridership goes to that station. So, you know, yes, it's an expense, but it also drives a significant portion of coaster ridership. So that's something to keep in mind.
Okay.
And it has put us in conversations with UCSD, right? Like,
Mhm.
what do we really want out of that connection, not only to Biocom, or the other businesses that are out there, but how do we get to the campus? So
Mhm.
we're taking care of everybody.
And I would just for the board, just say, so yes, the private entities, their support is important. But also, you know, that new service is now covering 5 trolley stations, as well as the UCSD campus. And so regional participation from others like UCSD, like MTS, like Sandag is also something we're pursuing. We didn't have that at launch because we felt like it was important to have continuity on the service. But we are pursuing other venues. Sandag has a number of grant programs that could fit for this. You know, we also think there's opportunities. MTS and UCSD have their Triton Pass. That there's a good case to be made for a larger portion of the Triton Pass now to come to NCTD because of that service. So we'll be knocking on those doors, but board support and us doing that is also very welcome.
No, and that would be great. When I went to UCSD, I wish it was more connected
Yeah.
because I had to drive. I commuted every single day. So for the commuters especially, that would be amazing to be able to like, and I know that it already exists, just being able to bring that in to NCTD would be awesome. And so I think so I have a few more questions. One was specifically around I think it was, the health contribution you mentioned. So that was something that hasn't been increased. Was that what you were saying,
Yes.
like for a while? Okay, and so that's why it's gone up by 20%.
So we intend to increase our contribution for employees, for this budget. We have now increased our employer portion of the health plan for over 10 years.
Okay,
We're not talking about large amounts of $55 per year
Yeah.
for single, $139 for family coverage.
yeah.
But our health insurance costs has sky
Yeah,
rocketed in the next 6 years. So that doesn't even cover, we're not even where we were back in 2013.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and even a little bit of a bounce off of that. One of the things that we, at least in my travels, that 2.5 months, I think we're able to get great employees in here that want to work. And they're a little bit turned off by the cost of the benefits and even our PTO plan that was changed back in 2022, I think. We have 2 different tiers of like a legacy PTO and then like a new PTO. And we have one of the lowest PTOs in the history of ever. And our insurance contribution, I can only speak for myself, like my family plan.
Yeah.
My contribution to health insurance was $750 a month, pre-tax. And like, I understand how that affects me. I can only understand how that affects someone who's making 75 grand a year, 100. And I think those things are keeping us from being competitive and wanting to close out some of these jobs. And I think it's a small give back to the employees. So part of the budget is not only to shore up, it's roughly 20% of the cost of the contribution, but also to revisit our PTO plan to try to merge everyone into one singular plan. Because that's been a little bit of a question we've had from employees who come in the door also. It's difficult to explain that in real time. And I think part of where we sidestep a little bit is, I think we talked about it before, is we have historically had quite a few job openings. Some of them at the lower level, like our train attendant on Sprinter, are very difficult to fill because when you add in the cost of insurance benefits and then the PTO and then the things they have to deal with as a train attendant, like even the pay bands are not necessarily correct on some of those frontline jobs. I mean, because of the changes the state has made, in some cases, our train attendant contracts say things like X dollars or minimum wage, whichever is higher, and that just shouldn't really be a thing. For us, at least, we're gonna ask somebody to be a train attendant on Sprinter and sort of manage fare compliance and some of that stuff. So I think we've got an opportunity over the next year to try to resolve those and shore them up and make sure they're still within compliance with the budget, but you know, that's a big piece we've heard right out the gate, where, you know, it's difficult for me to manage insurance because it's essentially $300 pre-tax a check for each employee who has a family plan.
Well, I appreciate you all bringing that forward. I'm glad that we're addressing it. I have 2 or 3 more questions. I promise I'll go fast. The other one I know is something that we've been talking about for a while, which is bringing the employees from MV in-house. And I mean, I'm supportive of that. It was something that we talked about for, again, like I think like at least since I've been on, maybe even longer. So just curious, how many employees is that? I don't think I've ever heard that number, but I could be, or has that not been decided? Is that kind of going to be?
So
yeah,
the plan, I think, is to potentially piecemeal a little bit, maybe talk about one department, then another department, then operations. So we're not putting a full burden on our finance and HR staff. Right now, I think it's about 450 employees. So we've got to essentially add another 450 FTEs to the payroll.
450.
Yeah, and so, you know, part of that is too, I think because we're an agency managing a contract agency, there's a little bit of redundancy at the management level in terms of who from the NCPD side manages the contract and who from the MB side manages the execution of the contract. There is a little bit of a cost, which you see in there, of the 4.4 million on insourcing, and a lot of that is health insurance and PERS, and maybe some other stuff that are sort of involved in that too. But you know, there's definitely, I think, a benefit to moving forward with what the board had requested. You know, I think it's a good move for NCTD. Do I think it's going to be cost neutral? I don't think so, because of the PERS piece potentially, but do I think that we'll gain the benefit of being able to better manage pieces of what affects us from an operational perspective by having them in-house? 100%. Especially from a service perspective, especially from management of service expansions potentially. So you know, we'll be talking more about that over the next year and a half. So
May I clarify and just so I can make sure I understood it accurately? When we start bringing the 450 FTE potentially in, the annual increase in cost would be 4.4, or is that just some?
So that's over the contracted piece. So right now we
Okay.
pay about $50.5 million a year to MB to manage bus
Yes.
operations.
Yes,
It would be about an additional 4.5 million
on top of that.
on top of that. Potentially, that's high end, just thinking about if the
Yeah.
employees move into a PERS scenario, some
Yeah.
sort of insurance scenario. So there's some things that we'll be able to leverage that might be advantageous to us. But I think Yoon's done a good job of sort of putting a number on what our potential liability could be.
Okay.
If everyone was at max capacity in a PERS scenario or in an insurance scenario.
Okay, so when we look at, kind of feed into my deficit question, which what Member Jenkins already asked and you answered, how we're looking at ways to make sure that we're hopefully going to avoid that at all, so my question would be, are those costs that we just discussed factored into these projections? Because we're thinking about bringing them in by next year, so I'm just trying to understand.
So the bus piece, yes, the fuel piece, no. So the projections of what that will, because the full transition of zero emission or gradual increases of, adding more zero emission fleet, that is not incorporated here,
Right.
but the bus piece it is.
So personnel wise, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Infrastructure wise, maybe not. I think because of what Member Jenkins brought up about we're not really totally sure what that impact is gonna be right out the gate. I think once we get a better bead to Chris's point of the 36 that we'll have in by later this year or early next year, maybe get a year under our belt of what those look like while we're transitioning some of the other fleet, we'll have a better bead on what that cost is for the next fiscal cycle.
Yeah, and for clarification, the employee piece, as Sean noted, we have the 50.5 million
Yeah.
under the MV contract. So in FY 25, if we were to bring portions of that internally in FY 25, we would look to we would look to reduce that 50 million to incorporate what we bring internal, just for clarification on it.
We would like that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just make sure I don't have any other questions. I don't think so. Okay, great. Any others that popped up while I was asking? Yeah.
One more. You made a comment that triggered me to think about something. So you mentioned about, so let me back up. In the past few years, when we've talked about bringing in these different things, we've always said that they would be cost neutral. We've evaluated everything. You just stated something may not be cost neutral, so that.
Yeah, I would say the piece that might be close to cost neutral is just the transition of the FTEs. The piece that's not cost neutral is we would have to figure out what pension plan they would end up in. Right now, they're in MV's retirement plan. And so they would either transition over to PERS or they may transition over to another plan. Like example, they're the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters has its own retirement plan. We may be able to work something out with the Teamsters. But there are employees who were in PERS before they transitioned over to MV. They may want to stay in PERS and keep that eligibility and continue on it. So we just have to figure out what that cost is. And I think the 4.4 represents worst case if all the employees transitioned over and we had to provide a contribution to the PERS plan. That's sort of the liability area that we live in. Then I think we'll be able to find some cost savings just in terms of redundancy or maybe some differentiation of how we would want to run that service versus how it is managing it from a corporate level. And that's not to take anything away from them. I don't necessarily think they're doing the wrong thing. They're doing exactly what they've been asked to do through their contract, but that's been a pretty long contract. So there may be some efficiencies for us to be able to solve in the interim that might offset that 4.4. But I'm always hesitant when people say publicly things like it's cost neutral. It's never cost neutral. It's either cost saving or cost more. And it depends on what you're talking about, whether it's labor, the insurance and benefits piece, or the actual operating cost. So I'm always a little leery when that comes up. I always want to say, we're hopeful it's as close to cost neutral as possible, but here's the things that can affect that. Time is one of those. Every year that goes by that we don't transition, it's just an additional potential cost to the agency in the transition.
So I guess my comment would be, because that has all been stated, because the cost neutral has been stated in the past, if it's changing, I just think the board needs to be fully.
Can we get a clarification on that, you?
Yeah, so there were two different transitions. One of them was their rail operations and maintenance, the facilities maintenance transition, and also maintenance away right away signals maintenance, and then we have the bus transition. The rail operations and maintenance, that is cost neutral. As a matter of fact, I would say that if we had gone back to procure the rail contract, it would be far more expensive than we had on the Nelson contract. The bus transition, when we went back to the board in December 2022, we shared with the board that that was not going to be possible. And that's the $4.4 million that I shared. That was in the staff report. We demonstrated where was the cost coming from. And the majority of the cost that was coming from the bus transition was related to the pension plan and to the health plan. So yes, cost neutral rail, but we did disclose back in December that bus was not going to be cost neutral.
And I would say
Yeah.
to your point, we would never want to engage in the whole transition without having a conversation with the board first and sort of mapping out our timeline and sort of showing what our plan is and what we want to do and make sure there's some board concurrence on that because just saying, yes, we're okay with you transitioning that. There's a ton of pieces that are happening in the backdrop. We want to make sure the board's aware of that, what impact they may have on the agency, sort of our timeline. So we would definitely bring that back to the board when we're ready. So.
And then, another question on the budgeted FTE page. You had said when bringing in the custodians affected the development services number. What other numbers have been affected here over the past few years that we've brought in? Because it seems like when I came on this board, I want to say we were maybe in the 200 something plus, number of FTEs, and we're considerably more. So there must be other areas besides the custodians.
Yeah, the rail transition was a
The
big-
rail
yeah,
here,
yeah.
okay, so this is. this-
Yeah, and then, also the rail right away, we
And
used to
rail
have only 2, 3 employees, and we brought in the, my trainers, and track maintainers, and.
So those three, that makes sense, because now, okay,
And also under development services, we also brought the entire facilities maintenance team, not just the custodians, those are what called janitorial services, we had a technician, so those were also included in that.
Okay.
Development services.
okay. So those are the three areas that have increased significantly. Okay, thanks.
So and we have a couple of minutes, just very general. So you mentioned, youth opportunity pass and that's good and we should keep it. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Why, I'm not saying that I'm against it, I actually like it, but I'd like to hear
Yeah, I would just say,
the reason behind that. How does it impact? Why is it good? What do we expect to get out of it?
yeah, so my experience with the Youth Opportunity Pass has been it's probably been a yes for ridership, but more about how it impacts things like truancy rates, school abilities to get to low-income breakfast and lunch. So like, I can only give you an example in Washington. We saw the truancy rate in our county drop fairly significantly when they didn't have to pay the 50-cent drop for the youth fare to get to school. And really during the pandemic, where it took off for us was children still needed to get to reduce breakfast and reduce lunch. And they weren't able to do that with parents that were either furloughed or were working during pandemic when they were at school. They needed to be able to get to the property to be able to. And so it's like a globalization issue for us in that, yes, we definitely see the ridership because the barrier for children, I think, in today's world is with 2 working parents, it's difficult to jump on the online portal and do some of the things you need to do or do those things. And not that we want to discontinue that, but once we take away that opportunity for the free transportation, it adds a burden to either parents to have to make a decision about whether their kids should go to school or how, especially like if you think about high school kids, how they transition from school to a job. So, right, so there's a taxation piece that if I can leave high school, go to work, I'm helping promote things in my community, right? So it's just like opportunity to jobs, opportunity to the next level of education. Like if they're taking college classes in a high school scenario, now they have access to Palomar, now they have access to San Marcos, UCSD, right? Like Coastal Valley Connection, right? So it's a little bit bigger than just the ridership piece. For us, I think in my experience, it's about really, 1, not creating a barrier, but 2, making sure that they're able to get to school, they're able to get to the job, they're able to get to some of these after school curricular activities, right? Like if a student needs to use public transportation to get to their, an example I can give you was we had a center called Furstenberg in Vancouver. And when we launched the Youth Opportunity Pass, Furstenberg Center, which was an after school center for kids, had to hire 2 more FTEs to be able to handle the amount of kids that were getting to the center. And that's just 1 more kid that is not at home.
On the street.
Right, they're in a community setting, being helped by people to do after school studies or point them in the direction for collegiate education or how to do job mentoring or job matching status that they're not getting. They need more help on from what they get from the counselors at school, right? So to me, it's sort of all these peripheral items and really it has a little bit less to do with the impact on the public transit system and more about how we're affecting the community at large. And that's to me why the Youth Opportunity Pass is.
Good, thank you, I appreciate that. There's some things there that are so eye-opening, a couple of things that I would say. I now have a student that I take to high school, and before I was like, why are we spending so much? Well, now all of a sudden, when I'm picking her up, I see, I don't know, hundreds of kids in line to get on the bus, right? And now they even have to have security there to make sure they're not cutting the line and all kinds of stuff, right? Okay, right? Question that I have regarding that, is that during entire operations of bus services, our youth opportunity pass, or is it during specific times?
Yeah, we don't have a restriction on that.
No, it's year
Yeah,
round.
it's year round, all service during.
Okay, and the reason I ask is because I've been riding around Escondido trying to learn about how, this works and how I feel about it and stuff. And I've gotten on buses and then these kids get on with the pizza and then they'll ask the driver, hey, can I go to the next one for free? And they happen to live where I was getting off there, they happen to live where I live. And so I was wondering if they had a limit, a limitation of time or anything.
Yeah, not at all. And I would say that's an interesting sort of story to tell. What that is, I noticed that myself when I worked in operations was we don't really deny rides to kids anyway. So what are we really trying to accomplish? Because if I'm a driver and kid can't pay, the last liability piece we want on the plan is to say, sorry, we're gonna leave you at this bus stop, we make it home. I mean, I think we have a little bit of a responsibility to take care of our youth and make sure they're covered and like, hey, can I go to the next stop for free? I don't know any driver in the world that's gonna be like, no, that's 50 cents, right? We want to make sure that we take care of that. And that's just part of one piece of the opportunity pass that I think is important.
And the truancy, has anyone asked the districts if they saw some kind of a drop like that?
It's a good question. We should probably ask that question.
Yeah, I don't know. Sandag's been monitoring the performance of the youth opportunity pass. I don't know if that's one of the things they looked at, but we can ask.
Yeah, I mean, not asking for a study, but
Right.
they should have those numbers and say, hey, there's some kind of a correlation. But anyway, those are my questions. Thank you.
Well, I think if we don't have any other questions, I know that this was informational, but it is scheduled to go to the full board for adoption at our regular board meeting on June 20th. And with that, our next scheduled meeting, our board forward on May 31st, 2024 at 10:30 a.m. The location is going to be Fletcher Cove Community Center, which is 133 Pacific Avenue in Solana Beach. The regular board meeting, June 20th, 2024 at 11 a.m. And that'll be at the City of Oceanside Chambers, 300 North Coast Highway, Oceanside. And then Marketing, Service Planning, and Business Development Committee meeting, June 27th, 2024 at 10 p.m. And that'll be at this location, 311 South Tremont Street, Oceanside. And with that, the meeting is adjourned at 11:29. Definitely.